Dr. Ashley Wood trained at Cardiff University as an optometrist, and he worked in practice as an optometrist in South Wales for some time. He became a lecturer at the university in 2013, and he's part of the university's growing Macula research group. So Cardiff University is now getting a very, very high reputation for its research into macular degeneration. And as he will explain, his current research is looking at some of the new methods that are being developed for monitoring AMD progression, and this is very important to find a way of stopping that progression. And he's also going to talk, this might sound a bit mysterious to begin with, he's going to talk about the possible therapeutic benefits of light. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ashley Wood.
Well, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me along to speak to you today. It's a pleasure to be here. As I've had from the introduction there, my background is actually in the detection and monitoring of AMD. And this is very important, having a sensitive and reliable tests to monitor the condition. Because as we sort of develop and come up with new potential treatments, it's important that we're able to see effectively if they're actually working and they're doing the job we want them to, or if they're not having an effect at all. One of the things we find is obviously with the traditional way of measuring vision, which is reading those letters down the chart, is not particularly sensitive, and particularly at the earliest stage of disease, many people will not actually experience any loss of that type of vision. And so developing these tests is very important. However, that's not what I'm going to be speaking to you about today. What I'm going to be speaking to you about are some novel approaches to actually treating age-related macular degeneration using light. And you may think, first of all, well, how can light actually help at all? We're surrounded by light all our lives, okay? Most of the time, we're entirely covered in light. How can it actually have any beneficial effect? Okay? So, in order to explain how light can be used and to have a beneficial effect and perhaps prevent the progression of AMD, I'm going to have to start off by giving you a little bit of a background into what AMD is and how the condition causes the damage that it does. And by understanding that, we can then see how light can be helpful and could be the basis of a potential treatments for AMD. So what I'm going to go through now is what we call pathogenesis, okay? It's a word, a scientific word, that essentially describes the manner and development of disease. So it's just so what's going on in the structure we're looking at, and why does the processes that are happening there lead to the damage and consequently to the loss of vision. So I think the first thing to start off with is actually thinking about what are the risks for macular degeneration. Well, the most obvious one, and one I'm sure everybody's aware of, is age. It's in the name, age-related macular degeneration. We can't do anything about this, but as we age, our risk of the condition increases. Okay? The older we get, the greater the risk becomes. If we live forever, we would all get age-related macular degeneration. And this is something we obviously can't do anything about. The other big risk is genetics. Okay? This is the genes that we inherit from our parents. And again, unfortunately, we can't do anything about this. But depending on our genes, some of us are more susceptible, and some people are less susceptible, depending on the genes we inherit. Smoking is something most people have heard, and this is something we can control. And therefore, it's very important that if you smoke, if we stop smoking, the risks are reduced and the effects of the condition are reduced. It doesn't mean that somebody who smokes all their life will definitely get the condition, but they're far more likely to than somebody who has never smoked. Diet, we've seen the benefit of supplements and the effect that diet can have. And there are a number of other factors which have also been associated. Exposure to light throughout life. If you have cardiovascular disease, such as high blood pressure and heart disease, your body mass index, or how overweight you are or even having had cataract surgery, all been associated with changing your risk of disease. So that's just a recap on the risks. The important thing to consider with AMD is that it is not one thing that results in you developing the condition and then the disease progressing and causing vision loss. It's actually a combination of a lot of different factors. And that can make it very difficult from a scientist's point of view of trying to work out the best way of treating the condition. So, we all know that AMD affects the macula in the eye, and it's important to consider what structures we've got here and why the macula is particularly affected. So we all know that the macula is a very special region at the back of the eye, and this is the part that deals with a high acuity vision, ability to see details. We use it to read, to watch the TV, and also to perceive colours. And this is the region that's affected. The reason that the macula is particularly susceptible is because it can do all this is due to the density of the light detecting cells in the retina called the photoreceptors, and they're the densest at the macula. Now, these photoreceptors, when they're working, are actually the most energy demanding part of our body. They require more energy and nutrition than the brain or any other tissue. Okay? And that makes it particularly vulnerable, particularly the macula where we have so many of these photoreceptors. And studies on animals show that even in the healthy eye, when you're young, that the actual oxygen available at the macula to these photoreceptors is almost entirely used up by what is supplied. So it only takes a very small reduction in the available oxygen, and the photoreceptors don't have enough to work properly. Okay? And that is one of the very important reasons of why we think we get some of the damage that occurs there, and is going to be something I'm going to come back to later on to why light therapy might be helpful in treating AMD. The other things we also want to consider are the other disease processes that are causing the damage. So these photoreceptors get their nutrition from a layer of blood vessels, okay, a very dense layer of blood vessels beneath the retina, which is almost next to the photoreceptors. Okay. Between the photoreceptors and this layer of blood vessels is a little membrane called Brooks membrane and a series of cells we call the retinal pigment epithelium. And it's this retinal pigment epithelium that is very important in the progress of age-related macular degeneration. These cells have the responsibility of transporting all the nutrients from the blood vessels in the choroid to the photoreceptors. They also have the responsibility of keeping the photoreceptors happy and also removing the waste that is produced once they've received the light and moving that back across this membrane into the blood. Now, as we get older, what happens to all these cells, like most of the rest of the cells in the body, is that they become less efficient. As we all age, one of the most obvious things we notice is that our skin becomes less elastic, we start to get wrinkles. And these sort of processes are occurring in all the cells in our body. All our cells are aging. But it has a particularly disastrous effect on these RPE cells. So as they get older, they find it harder and harder to clear the waste and transport the nutrients. We start to get the buildup of waste products around these cells, particularly on this membrane. We first see that when we examine your eye. So whenever you go to the optometrist, one of the first signs of age-related macular degeneration are these yellow deposits called drusen at the back of the eye. And this is the first signs of this waste not being cleared and the RPE not working as well as it used to. So this is contributing, is one of the causes that leads to some of the damage in AMD. These waste products also slow down the transfer of nutrients to the photoreceptors as well as not being the clearing to it. Over time, the photoreceptors do not get the nutrition that they need, and the RPE cells themselves don't get the nutrition that they need. These waste products are also toxic at some levels. As you get more of them, it causes more and more problems, and it begins to slow down these cells, and as they become less efficient, due to the waste products, the lack of oxygen getting to them, the problem starts to accumulate and gets worse. They get less energy, they're able to clear less waste, and it starts to build up. And it's a positive feedback. So as it gets worse, it contributes to getting even worse in the future. And eventually, the build-up of this waste and all the toxic material will eventually cause the cells to stop working, and then they eventually die. And that's when we start to get vision loss, as our photoreceptors and the RP cells which support them start to die off. Okay. In terms of what's happening in the eye, there are a number of other factors that are going on. The materials also cause inflammation, and inflammation can also damage the cells. And within the cells themselves, we also have little structures which produce the energy. So they take the oxygen and convert it into energy for the cells. And these also get more tired as they get older and less effective. And as they do so, as they become less effective, they also start producing certain toxins which can damage the cells themselves. So as you can see, there's a number of different processes that are sort of related to each other, okay, going on, which all contribute to making the cells less effective and causing death of the cells eventually. In particular, one of the effects which I'm going to concentrate on today is the presence of hypoxia, the lack of oxygen. Okay. So not only does it make the cells work less well, but this is also the cause of wet AMD. Okay. So wet AMD is a particular subtype of the condition, and this is caused when there is a lack of oxygen in the retina over a period of time, and it reaches a certain stage where those RPE cells are struggling to cope, and what they do is they send out a little signal to the surrounding tissues, and particularly to the blood vessels in the choroid. And this is almost like a distress signal. They're saying, we haven't got enough oxygen, we're struggling to survive, and the response of those blood vessels is we need to provide them with more oxygen. And what happens now is that those blood vessels start growing and grow across this membrane into the retina. And it's this growth of these new blood vessels in the wet AMD. They are very leaky, they tend to bleed, and they leak fluid. They damage the retina that's there, which causes further damage. They provide the oxygen, but they cause a very rapid, sudden loss of vision. Okay? And this little signal which is sent from the RPE which causes this growth is called something called VEGF. And some of you might have heard that term before. Okay? Thankfully now, if this is detected early when this starts to occur, we have the injections, which is what we call anti-VEGF. And what they do is they basically go in, it's injected into the eye, and it basically knocks out those signals from the RPE telling them that they're short of oxygen, and basically we want blood vessels to give us more oxygen. Okay. What I'm going to talk about now is some ways of stopping that, maybe before we even get to the stage where the blood vessels grow. Okay. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is one therapy which is based on red light. So the story actually starts off in space for this one. Okay. The space program run by NASA wanted to basically come up with ways of growing plants in space, giving their plants the best way to grow. And one of the things they were looking at was what coloured lights or what light do they need to give to the plants in order to make them grow better and stronger, and so they could grow those. So essentially they were growing sort of bigger tomatoes for their astronauts. And the question was asked, when they showed that they could make these cells grow more quickly and be more productive, could we get similar results in humans? And so NASA spent some more time looking at this, And in 2001, NASA supported a study which actually showed not only could you get similar things in cells in animals from mice and rats, that these cells could grow more quickly and more productively just by shining some red light onto them, but they also found that wound healing in humans was actually sped up by 40% just by the fact of shining light on to these wounds. And that was a very interesting thing to highlight. Since then, people have looked at this, and over about the last 15 years, there has been a lot of studies that have tried using red light in order to sort of heal different conditions to have a positive effect. And studies have shown that it's a nervous system, so where you've damaged your spinal cord or your nerves elsewhere in the body, that red light has been beneficial. And particularly in following strokes, people have found that by using red light, they can improve recovery from conditions such as stroke. And also, it is shown to have some positive effects in retinal degenerations. One area that didn't have a positive effect was in healing for burns. So it's not the panacea cure for everything, but it's certainly looking very positive. So we've got this red light. We think it does some good things, okay? But the question really is now is, how does it work? So the red light itself is a very specific wavelength, 6-7 nanometers, which probably doesn't mean very much to you, but it means it's a very specific color of light. And they actually found that this particular wavelength of light is absorbed by an enzyme within all of our cells in our body called cytochrome C oxidase. And again, at the moment, that's going to mean very little to you, okay? But this enzyme is found in the mitochondria in all of our cells. This is the energy-producing part of a cell. And you can think of this like the engine in your car, okay? So your engine produces all the power in your car. Everything else wouldn't work without it. And this is the same in our cells. These mitochondria get the oxygen we breathe and use the glucose from our food and essentially burns it to create energy for the cell. And one of the enzymes involved within the mitochondria for doing this process, producing the energy in our cells, is cytochrome C oxidase. Now, as I said earlier, one of the things that happens as we get older is that these mitochondria in our cells gradually get less efficient. They produce less energy, they produce more waste and pollution as they're working. And that is one of the factors that has been implicated in the progression of macular degeneration. It's not the only factor, but it's one of the contributing factors that has been identified. And so the potential here is, by exposing the mitochondria to this red light, we make this enzyme, cytochrome C oxidase, more effective. It rejuvenates it, makes it work a little bit better. It's a bit like putting a drop of rocket fuel in your car. It'll go along for a little bit longer and you get a burst of energy out of it. So that is the theory. And if we can get that extra energy, perhaps the RPE cells will look a little bit better. They'll have a little bit more energy to clear some of the waste and to transport the nutrients to the photoreceptors. Now, there has been a series of small-scale studies that have looked now actually at using this light in human eyes. One such study was in 2008, which looked at 203 patients at all stages of AMD. And what they'd done here was they just got a little laser, okay, and shone it onto the white of the eye. So the light goes through the white of the eye, and enough of it reached the macula. And this was done 4 times over a 2-week period. And essentially what they'd done was they measured the visual acuity, i.e. how well the patient saw before the treatment, and they then just measured it again afterwards. And what they reported in here was that over 90% of the eyes showed some kind of improvement in terms of the number of letters being able to be read. Okay. And some of them, with most, over half of them actually getting a 2-line improvement. The other thing that came out of it, there was no negative side effects. But obviously, this was a very small study, and it was only sort of exploratory. So, sounds very positive, but we can't take too much from that. In 2012, there is also a later study, which also on a smaller scale looked at 18 patients with the dry type of AMD and treated it again with a LED light this time rather than a laser. So he does it 18 times for 2 minutes each as their treatment. And again, they show for a short period, up to 3 months after the treatment, they reported an increase in visual acuity and other measures of function of the eye. So not just acuity, but other ways we can measure vision were also improved for a short period afterwards. Unfortunately, with that, they monitored them for over a year, and after that 3-month period, the level of vision returned back to what it was at the start. But for that short period, they found a small improvement. But again, it's a relatively small study. Very recently, though, at UCL in London, a group under a gentleman called Glenn Jeffries looked at studying mice and was more specifically looking at the effect of 670 light on these retinas and what was actually going on in the actual retina of these mice. And the reason we use mice is obviously we can't just take a human retina out and have a look at it under the microscope, because obviously that's not really feasible. So we're using mice in the study. So they had 29 mice. In one box, they kept them, but they didn't expose them to the light. In another box, what they'd done was over a period of 14 days, they exposed them for 6 minutes in the morning, 6 minutes in the evening, to this 670 red light. And what they'd done is at the end of that 14 days, they compared the ones that didn't have the light to the ones that had it. And what they'd done was they took the retinas out of the mice and actually looked at what had changed in them. And to make, I forgot to mention, was that these mice were particularly bred to develop macular degeneration, or very equivalent in the mice. They used mice that would develop that. Okay, and what they found was that when they looked at these, that the signs of inflammation, which is associated with AMD, was reduced. They had less of the inflammatory cells associated with that, and less of the proteins associated with inflammation. And these were significantly reduced in the actual retina as a result of the red light treatment compared to the mice that didn't get it. So that was a very positive sign that actually the red light was having some effect, having an effect on the eyes. Obviously, with this work, it hasn't yet gone into humans, but at the moment we are applying for funding for what we call phase 1 clinical trial to see how effective this might be in humans, and whether also exposing people to periods of red light it has any other detrimental effects before going to look at it further. The other approach, okay, is what we call overnight low light therapy. And this is based on a completely different approach, but is still related to the availability of oxygen to the retina. So as we know, the photoreceptors themselves use the most oxygen in the body, and the lack of that oxygen is one of the factors in age-related macular degeneration. Now, when we're in the dark, those photoreceptors actually use the most energy at any time. So in the light, they use quite a lot of energy, but when they're in the dark, they use an awful lot. Okay? And as I said before, the available oxygen, even in a healthy eye, is very borderline to supply the oxygen needed. So as you get older and less oxygen supplied, particularly in the dark, your eye is going to be in a state of hypoxia where there isn't enough oxygen. And if we think about most people, we sleep, and we generally sleep in the dark. So there is a period of the day where we're where we're sleeping, and these photoreceptors are in the dark and using up all this extra oxygen. And it's thought that this period is when we're most at risk of getting sort of the damaging effects of the shortage of oxygen. So the obvious solution here is that if we don't have the retina in darkness during the night, we won't use up as much oxygen, the retina won't suffer from the effects of the hypoxia so badly, and therefore we might be able to slow down or reduce the progression of the condition because we don't have that hypoxia. And so the theory here is that if we expose the patient to light overnight, then we won't get that dark adaptation to the darkness and that demand. The problem, however, is that most people don't want to be kept up all night with a light shining in their eyes, okay? Which is obviously a bit of a drawback, particularly if we think of our circadian rhythm, our ability to sort of know when day is night has a greater effect on us. So we have to be very careful about the amount of light and also the type of light. So what it's come up with is the cells which are sensitive to circadian rhythm are actually only sensitive to blue light. So one of the ideas is to use a mask which uses longer wavelength, it doesn't use blue light, so it actually has a more of a greeny colour to it. To wear these masks during the night with only a very low level, but enough to stop the eye fully adapting and using up as much oxygen. And it is hoped by doing that, it reduces the progress of the condition. And in fact, this is being studied at the moment in a phase 1, early phase 2 trial at Bristol Eye Hospital, a trial called the A-Light trial. I don't know if anyone's come across it, but essentially what they're doing is they're identifying patients with early age-related macular degeneration, with one eye that has already progressed to the wet stage of the condition, but the other eye has not. And what they're doing is giving these patients these basically eye masks, which is very low level light, to wear overnight, and they're monitoring them for over a year and hoping to find that those that have been wearing the masks compared to the group that hasn't will have a slower rate of progression and less outcomes which go on to the wet form of the condition. So that's something that's currently being undertaken at this time. The other thing in this case is also that there are studies that are using the same approach, but not in age-related macular degeneration, but there are also 2 studies being planned which is looking at diabetic macular edema. And in this condition too, the lack of oxygen is also one of the key identified factors that contributes to the progress and worsening of that condition. And there's also clinical trials, one which is due to be underway in Moorfields in London, and there's also another in the United States, again looking at using this type of masks, wearing them overnight to try to reduce the light and reduce the damage from lack of oxygen.